Welcome to a very important discussion about the future, something that's going to happen more and more through the church entering the future. And that's how church mergers lead to reproducing and multiplying churches. You have a co-presentation today. Let me introduce Jim Tomberlin, a multi-site pioneer, a pastor for many years, a merger specialist in more recent years, working now on both multi-site and merger for the Unstuck group, and always having his feet planted firmly in the local church right now as chief of staff at Christ Fellowship Miami. Jim, look forward to doing this presentation with you.
Well, Warren, it's great to be with you, my co-author, and who's also been a pastor, seminary professor, author of 33 books, currently serving as the Vice President of Research at the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability. And I call him affectionately Mr. Church Encyclopedia, because I don't know of anyone who knows more about the church today than Warren Bird.
Well, we do have some good statistics to share with you. And but first, let's start with kind of an overview. Jim, what is new in church mergers?
Well, church mergers are exploding across the country. We're seeing more and more mergers for lots of different reasons. We're seeing churches that are discovering they can look for a pastor. Churches without pastors are finding their pastors through a church merger. There are pastors who are looking for their successor, and there are churches that are finding that successor through a merger. There are churches that are wanting to become more diverse and are finding a merger as a way to reflect more the community of diversity. And these are some of the things that are unfolding.
And yet the original impetus that got the original edition of our book Better Together going was the multi-site movement. And in fact, that has continued with no signs of slowing down. And you're seeing on your screen a merger fact. And we actually did a big research project leading up to the expanded and updated edition of the book. We sprinkled the book with 28 merger facts. We'll show you a bunch of them on the presentation today. But this one is emphasizing that 40% of multi-site churches come by way of a merger. Multi-site campuses come by way of a merger. That's very significant. But you know what? The newest discovery we made, which we made merger fact number 1 in our presentation, that 20% of mergers become a location for a new or replanted church. That is very significant for church planters as yet another impetus on what's happening with mergers. So who's the merger candidate?
That's a great question, Warren. You know, there's over 320,000 Protestant churches across the United States. And at the Unstuck group, we actually have a self-assessment tool that churches, a free self-assessment tool that churches can go onto our website and determine where they are in the different stages of the life cycle of a church. We've actually identified 7 different stages, and you can take this test, and we've had over 25,000 churches take this self-assessment tool. And as we have summarized what we've found out from those tests those self-assessment tool, that all churches fall into about 3 broad categories. 61% are stuck. That is, they are not going out of business, but they're not growing. They're capable of maintaining, and some are comfortable with that, some are not. But then we also know that about 25% of the churches are struggling. That is, they are in life support, life preservation mode, very, very vulnerable. But then, in spite of that scenario, there's 14% of the churches nationwide that are strong. They're growing, they're healthy, they're reaching people. And so when we ask the question, who's a good candidate for a merger, all 3 of those are. A stuck church can be revitalized by joining with a strong church. A struggling church can be reborn and get a second chapter, a second life by joining with a strong church. A strong church can extend its impact and outreach by other churches joining with them in their mission. And so we're seeing all 3 kinds of churches are great candidates for merging.
So Jim, let's deal with some of the questions that you and I get, the very practical questions that we hear the most. And I think probably the most common is, who initiates the merger? But before you explain it, why don't you define a couple of terms?
Well, it's very important in the merger conversation to see a merger like a dance, and that every merger involves a lead church and a joining church, where one leads and the other follows. The joining church is the church that is absorbed by or integrated into the lead church's mission, vision, strategy, or culture. It's very important, Warren, at the very beginning of a merger conversation, that the two church parties, the two church leadership boards, or the two pastors understand one leads and the other follows. It doesn't say one's more important than the other. They are both valuable, but you can't, like in a dance, the same in a merger, you can't have two leads, you can't have two follows. One leads and the other follows. And if this is clearly defined up front, it creates a lot of disappointment down the road.
So another merger fact, you say, well, if you got a lead church and a joining church, who initiates? Actually, the answer is yes. We have the joining church initiates probably more than others, but the lead church does as well. And then you have an outside group like a consultant or a denominational leader who may also lead the process. And by the way, everything that we're talking about today, we probably have a whole chapter on in the expanded and updated edition of Better Together. So if you want more, go there and look. But Jim, lead us a little farther in the who initiates question.
Well, using the dance analogy, we like to talk about the big dance here involves three big steps or three big moves. We put it in question form. The first step is two church leaders begin to talk to each other. Is this possible? Is it even possible, conceivable, that we could come together? And if they decide, it's possible, then the next question or the next move is, okay, it's a nice idea, but is it really feasible? Is it doable? And as we work through those questions, those issues, and we talk about that process in our book, if they conclude, it's not only possible, it's doable. But the last move is, but is it desirable? And that typically is determined normally by the two congregations in a church-wide vote or church-wide affirmation of the leadership's decision. And so we like to describe this dance in these three big moves. Is it possible? Is it feasible? Is it desirable?
So now let's keep coming back to who initiates. We also ask, well, why would you initiate? And we gave a bunch of reasons. And for lead churches, the dominant reason, why would I want to be involved in a merger? It was a pair of either revitalization to help a church that's struggling, want to put my arm around that church's shoulder and see how we can support and encourage and maybe help them start a new life cycle. Or it's just overt evangelism. We want to reach more people for Christ. And merging seems to be the way to open new doors and new locations. Now, for joining churches, we have a merger fact about that too. For joining churches, more often, but not exclusively, the reason to merge is survival. And then we have a whole lot of other reasons that may affect why you would want to merge. Now, that may lead you to wonder, and it's a question we get a lot, are all mergers the same? And to me, Jim, what you're about to say is, I think, one of the most repeated things that I hear people pick up from the book, one of the biggest ahas. So unpack this diagram for us.
The answer is no, not all mergers are not the same. We've actually defined 4 distinct kinds of mergers. And it's very important in the beginning of the conversation between two churches that they land on the same understanding that what kind of merger this is. First kind is a rebirth merger, which is more like being an absorption where a struggling, declining church is absorbed into a strong, healthy church. That's a rebirth. That's probably 50% of the mergers that occur. Are rebirth mergers. Then there's those we call an adoption merger, where it's more like an integration, where one church is integrated into and under a lead church. They bring something to the table that gets integrated into the merged church. It's more like an adoption. Then we have a merger that we describe like a marriage merger. Now, Warren, as you and I have talked about, we know there's very few that are truly a marriage, because marriage involves or implies equality, equal partners. And rarely is a merger two equal partners, but it's more like a realignment of two churches that they're coming together and they're bringing their strengths and weaknesses, and they are realigning themselves under a new mission and vision together, like a marriage, two people coming together and creating something new together. And then there's the ICU mergers, which most people are familiar with, which was really the old mergers of the past that were more survival driven than they are mission driven, like the first three that we described. And these were two churches that are struggling, they're declining, and they're coming together, joining together with the hope to survive, usually unintentionally, but very truly at the expense of the other, like two people drowning and holding on to one another to survive at the expense of the other. And so these are the four kinds of mergers that we have defined and described. And as we mentioned, it's very important at the beginning of this conversation that both church groups, both churches land in agreement about who's the lead, who's the follow. Is this a rebirth, or is this an adoption? Is this a marriage? And that is the groundwork of defining the relationship that allows this conversation to move forward in a healthy way.
And just to be clear, and I think, Jim, we actually titled a chapter of the book that presents it. It's one of our longer chapter titles, 4 models for how a merger happens, one of which almost never works. So let's be clear that that last one, the ICU, is the model of the past and almost always failed. Now, I do have a little merger fact to throw in here because everybody tends to ask immediately when you look at the models of, okay, well, but what about the pastor of the joining church? And we found that most joining churches have a pastor who stays, 79%, but usually not in the role of lead pastor, or even if it becomes multi-site, campus pastor of that campus. But there are a variety of other roles, and our little merger fact unpacks that a little further. But Jim, back to you with a new question. How long does a merger typically take? And to help you out, we have a merger fact for you. Yes.
Well, we know from our survey, 8 months is the average length of a merger from the initial conversation to the final approval of the two churches. Now, we have developed a process of that period, usually 8 months or so, goes through 5 stages in this merger conversation. And we kind of describe it this way. And we have those pictures there. The first stage is obviously the exploration stage. It's more like dating. It's where you're defining the relationship. Who's the lead? Who's the follow? What kind of merger is this? And once you've landed that, and you still want to keep the dance going, then the next stage is negotiation. It's more like the courtship. It's where you're really seeing, are we compatible? And we've identified actually 25 distinct issues that every church merger has to address. Most of them are benign issues, but there's usually 4 or 5 that are problematic or game changer, deal-breaking issues. But if those two churches can work through those issues and land in a good place for the 25 issues now, and they become convinced that God is leading us together to become one church in 2 locations, or one church in 1 location. But then it's a time of declaring that to their 2 churches, to 2 congregations. It's like an engagement period where you go public and say, hey, we're going to get married. We want to, we believe God's leading us together. And so we roll out a announcement, a recommendation to the congregations. We have town hall meetings and Q&A sessions with the 2 congregations where we're over communicating. This is why we believe God is leading us together. This is how it will look if we do this. Why are we doing this? And so all that time of sharing publicly that we're coming together, then that culminates in the wedding. That is the consolidation of the 2 churches becoming one. And that's usually determined by a vote or an affirmation of the 2 congregations of the decision of the leadership. And then after a wedding comes the marriage, the integration. And during that time, over the next year or 2, is a time of those 2 congregations stabilizing, growing, multiplying. And so this kind of is the overall process. And we help churches through these stages as they go through this journey together.
And Jim, I know that was a lot of content to unpack. And yes, for those who want to dig deeper, we have one or more chapters on the book that impacts it. But let's come back to the questions that people ask us. I always love it when someone says, okay, I got this framework, but now help me know what the most important questions I should be asking are. And actually 3 times in the book, Jim, we give a set of questions because we think these are so fundamental that somewhere along the line, everybody should be asking. So why don't we go through those? You want to start?
I would say, first of all, the first question, would our congregation, would my congregation be better by merging rather than remaining separate? Could my church be better off by merging with this other church?
And that's a great question to pray about, to explore scripture about, to really seek the mind of God, and to learn what the Holy Spirit is saying to the leaders in the congregation, and if applicable, to the denomination as well. The second question, could we accomplish more together than we could separately? So this is that synergy question between 2, sometimes 3 congregations. Could we accomplish more together?
And then the third question is, would our community that we share, would it be better served if we joined together?
And the fourth, could the kingdom of God be further enlarged by joining together? God is growing his kingdom, and is our part in it going to work better if we are together or if we continue separately? Now, let me give you another merger fact, because many people say, well, okay, but the first thought that so many people are going to have is people will leave if we merge. And actually, we found when we asked, this was like almost 1,000 churches that had been involved in a merger, well, so what percent of the congregation left? We found only a small percentage of the joining churches members departed post-merger. And so if people say, well, okay, that was probably our first success measure, I'd like to push back a little bit and say there are other better questions, additional questions that you could ask to define, well, what does merger success look like? So Jim, why don't you set that up for us?
Well,
before we do, sorry, I got another merger fact that 82% of congregations, when asked, said, yes, we do the merger again. And then this graphic kind of breaks down all kinds of different groups. Well, what about denominational mergers? What about the joining church versus the lead church? What about a church plant and so forth? Said they do it again. And then again, only a small percentage of the joining church members departed post-merger. Okay, now Jim, talk to us about success.
Well, it's a very important question because people often come into this merger conversation with a faulty thinking about what a merger success looks like. They often think merger success is 100% retaining of staff, church members, and attenders. And no, really, success is focusing on retaining people who embrace a shared vision for the future. Now, before you go further, Warren, let me just say, as Warren just pointed out, the majority of your church family will join the transition and stay with the merger, but there's going to be some who will leave. But what's more important is that those who stay embrace the shared vision for the future. And so it's not 100% retaining of staff, church family, but retain people who embrace a vision for the future. It's not 100% approval of the members. That rarely happens, but it's overwhelmingly approved in every merger that I've been involved with when it got to the vote. But it's 100% engagement of those who approve. That's success. Success is not saving a facility for emotional or nostalgic reasons, but it's really about stewarding a facility for kingdom purposes. Success is not about preserving a church name, but it's really about leveraging the legacy of that church. It's not about maintaining the status quo, but it's more about beginning a new life cycle. Those are the key factors for success.
Let me throw in one more merger fact. Almost 6 in 10 of the joining church facilities continue to be used. Now, sometimes it becomes a multi-site campus. Sometimes it becomes the one and only campus of the church. Sometimes it becomes a certain ministry area for youth or counseling or outreach into the community. But here are all the reasons of what happens to the building, because that's often a question that's asked. Now, suppose somebody's heard all this and said, okay, I wonder if God wants me to explore mergers just a little further. What would you say the next steps are, assuming that they have a bit of clarity on, am I the joining church or lead church? And again, we got whole chapters in the book to help you discern which hat would be the better match for who you are and where you are as a church.
Well, you can see on the slide, we have several steps for each church type, whether you're joining or leading, but you can boil that down into what I call the 3 R's. Relationship. The best mergers, the soil for the best merger outcome comes out of relationships. And so that's step 1, relationships with other local pastors and church leaders. And then resourcing one another, helping one another. That's where partnership does build a basis for a potential merger. And then request, that is, make the ask. Hey, could we be better together? Or ask your denominational leader or network leader, I'm interested in joining with another church, or could we be helpful to another church in revitalizing through a merger? But these are some of the steps.
Before we go on, let me just point out in the left-hand column there, that assessment is the same assessment you referred to at the top of our presentation with the bell curve of the Tony Morgan group, that Unstuck group that 25,000 churches have taken, and you too can take it free if that will help you as part of your discernment process. So the bottom line is that we are eager to see you explore ways that you might be better together. And Jim, why don't you land us, hey, you're serving a church that it too has experienced mergers. Give us just a glimpse of how Christ Fellowship Miami is better together because of one or more mergers.
Yes, I'm sitting here in Miami today with my Christ Fellowship t-shirt on, and our church is 103 years old. It was planted by the Central Baptist Church of Miami 103 years ago. About 10 years ago, that church, the downtown campus, a beautiful 1,200-seat auditorium that is on the historical register of the city, something that looks like it'd be built you'd find in Milan, Italy. 10 years ago, that congregation had dwindled down to 50 people. And they approached and called out to their daughter church out in the suburbs of Miami and said, you're a multi-site church. You are a vibrant, growing church. We are in declining, and we're not going to survive. We'd like to give you our building and join you and let you rebirth a church in downtown, one of your multi-site campuses. And that's what happened. Now, that's just a story that happened to us. That conversation is happening all across the country. And you don't have to go out of business. You don't have to die. You don't have to be stuck. A church merger can be a way for revitalization, for rebirth, for expansion. And that could be your story. And we're here to help that journey happen for churches who are ready to take that next step.
To be better together.